Hello and welcome to the webinar series titled Doing Academia Differently in Conversation with Neuroatypicality. This new webinar series follows on from the previous 14 webinars on post-philosophies and the doing of inquiry, hosted by a collaboration between Geert Van Hove from Ghent University, Viv Bozalek from the University of the Western Cape, and myself, Candace Kuby from the University of Missouri. And Nikki Romano is here as a support and go-to person in the series, who's offered the artwork for the series, who posts our recorded webinars online for people to view. We're very grateful for Nikki's support in the webinar series. So as I said, this is a free webinar series. There's 10 total sessions. We meet monthly, and each session involves one or two international guests who have had some experience with neuroatypicality in the context of higher education. The webinar series is made possible by a research collaborative partnership between three universities, the University of Missouri System in the US, University of Ghent in Belgium, and the University of the Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between the University of Missouri and UWC started way back in 1986, and UWC and the University of Ghent have had a partnership for over 20 years. The Tri-Continental Partnership is a trilateral agreement that was set to promote partnerships between our three institutions during a time of travel restrictions due to the global pandemic. The funds were provided to support virtual research and teaching collaborations between faculty members at our institutions, and we are so grateful for our university's longtime collaboration and particularly the support of this webinar series. These webinars are also available on YouTube. You can go to the webinar series website and find a link to access them. And then you can also subscribe to the YouTube series channel. Also on YouTube, you can select an option for closed captioning to see the written transcript of the webinar recording. We have updated our website with exact times for each webinar in order to take into account daylight savings time and how that affects different contexts across the world. So always be sure to check the website for the exact time for each of our webinars. So today we have two panelists with us. I'm going to ask them to unmute themselves here shortly and just introduce themselves, kind of where they are in the world right now, a brief introduction, and say hi to all that are joining us today. And then we'll have more thorough introductions of them a little bit later in the webinar. So Elisabeth, would you all like to unmute and do a brief introduction of yourselves?
Okay. For us, it's good afternoon, but I know that it's different sometimes. So good afternoon, everybody. I am Elisabeth Schauwer. I work at Ghent University.
And I am Leni van Goidsenhoven, and I work at the University of Antwerp. Yeah, that's it from now.
Thanks and welcome to you both. We're really excited to have a conversation with you today. Viv is going to start us off with a few more introductions.
Sorry, just unmuting. I'd like to introduce Nikki Romano, who's a PhD student at the University of the Western Cape and Utrecht University, who's she's already submitted her PhD and is just awaiting the defense and the reports. And she's a lecturer in art history at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. And as Candace mentioned, we've used Nikki's art for this series. She's an artist and an art educator, and she's been teaching art in cross sectors, from children to higher education. And she's going to be providing the technical support in the webinar platform today. And she's also going to be helping with the Q&A sessions, which Candace will tell you more about as part of the webinar. So thanks very much to Nikki for all the work she does for the series, and I'm going to hand over to her.
Thank you, Viv, and it's my job to introduce you to our three co-hosts. Candace Kuby is the Professor of Learning, Teaching and Curriculum at the University of Missouri, where she's Department Chair and the Director of Qualitative Inquiry. Dr. Kuby's research interests include the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools, approaches to and pedagogies of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structuralism and post-human philosophies. Candace is the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry, Posthumanism and Literacy Education, Knowing, Becoming, Doing Literacies, and Disrupting Qualitative Inquiry, Possibilities and Tensions in Educational Research. Her scholarship appears in journals, several journals, including Qualitative Inquiry, the International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, the Journal of Early Childhood Literacy, the Journal of Literacy Research, and Cultural Studies, Critical Methodologies. Geert Van Hove is a professor in disability studies at Ghent University. His field of research is disability studies and inclusive education. Professor Van Hove was the Disability Studies Professor of the Endowed Chair of Disability Studies at VUMC Amsterdam in the Department of Medical Humanities from 2013 to 2018. In 2017, he was the recipient of the Stephen Taylor Memorial Senior Scholar Award at the Disability Studies and Education Conference in Minneapolis. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape, as well as honorary professor in the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, posthumanism and feminist new materialisms, innovative scholarly practices in higher education, and post-qualitative and participatory methodologies. Her most recent co-edited books of 2021 include Posthuman and Political Care Ethics for Reconfiguring Higher Education, Post-Anthropocentric Social Work, Critical Posthumanism and New Materialist Perspectives, and Higher Education Ontologies, Living with Ghosts for a Justice to Come. Welcome, all of you, and over to Candace.
Thanks, Nikki. So I'll give a brief overview of how the webinar will unfold today, and then we'll get into conversation with our two guests. So as you might have noticed, we're using the webinar platform instead of the meeting platform. So at this time, the hosts have access to video and audio. During the question section of our webinar today, we will give our guests, our participants that are here joining us today, the option to open their video setting and audio if they want to engage in our Q&A session in that way. So just stay tuned. As we get to that, we will send a note and allow you to unmute if you would like. As we mentioned, we are recording this webinar for public viewing later on YouTube. The chat function is open for you during the entire webinar today for you to connect with other attendees. If you would prefer to write rather than ask a question verbally, you can do so with the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This will make it easier for us to moderate the questions so we're not scrolling through the chat box and the Q&A box at the same time. So please take a moment if you're not familiar with the Q&A button to locate it at the bottom of your Zoom screen. The structure of the webinar is as follows. For the first 30 to 40 minutes, Geert will interview Elisabeth and Leni on our 4 main questions, which is a common thread for all of the webinars in this series, and you can find those questions on our webpage. While discussing these questions, Elisabeth and Leni will share some examples from their scholarship, as well as their experiences and perhaps some examples from the suggested readings that they shared on our website. Finally, we will open a space for the attendees who want to be in conversation to ask questions of Elisabeth and Leni. Again, we'll prompt you if you'd like to turn your audio and video on at that time. We hope to have at least 30 minutes for this, so we suggest that you jot down any questions or comments that arise during the webinar, or you're welcome to go ahead and type them in the Q&A button at any time, and we'll get to them a little bit later on in the webinar. So I think at this time, we're going to jump into conversation. So Geert's going to do some introductions and begin our questions and conversation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are in the world. It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce the 2 colleagues that will be working with us this afternoon. I think I know they are pretty well prepared, and I think I know they want to share a PowerPoint while they are talking. Dr. Leni van Goidsenhoven likes to dive into crypt theory, literary theory, and new materialism. I know she read a lot and she's reading every day and every night. She has a special interest in the importance of imagination in research, reconceptualization of voice, and working with the not yet known. And as you can see on the screen, she is the mother of a beautiful son who is joining us this afternoon. And I can imagine that he will give his comments later on after we were listening to his mother. And I hope he can disrupt a little bit this afternoon session too. We have as a second panelist, Professor Elisabeth Schauwer, who is a guest professor at Ghent University. I think she is seen as the leading researcher in a researchers collective about disability studies in Ghent University. She offers a lot of time to teaching and doing research about diversity and struggling with inclusion. And she focuses on interactions with difference in all kinds, but especially pedagogical relationships. Elisabeth has 3 children. They are not on the screen yet. Perhaps they will jump in later on. They are a bit older than Fritz, but I think when Suze will meet Fritz, that Fritz will be very happy. As you know, Elisabeth and Leni, we work with 4 questions in every webinar, and we were discussing these questions also in a very nice breakfast moment in a very nice breakfast cafe at Ghent, at the center of Ghent. And you know that the first question we work with is the idea, what does neuroatypicality mean for higher education? Is this the moment you want to share your PowerPoint already?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
Do you see it now?
Perfect.
Yeah, right. Well, indeed, the first question about what is neurodiversity and what does it mean for higher education? There we really want to begin with what does neurotypicality mean for us and how we are working with it. Well, we start from our angle of disability studies and crypt theory, which means that we don't understand disability as something inherent to a specific individual, but always as a phenomenon that emerges in the interaction between humans and non-human relations and contexts. And it's in that sort of framework that we also sometimes use phrases like, we take a neurodiverse stance on, or this paper aims to expand the neurotypical understanding of, for instance, voice, by which it is our aim mainly to make clear that we use neurodiversity as a paradigm, as a way of thinking, and not as something connected to a specific identity or identity politics. And the paradigm helps us really to work with questions as which lives do we value, who counts as human, why, and how. And we open with a quote of Erin Manning, and it goes like this: neurodiversity is the path I choose here to explore insurgent life. Encouraged by neurodiversity activism, I take neurodiversity as a platform for political change that fundamentally alters how life is defined and valued. I do this with neurodiversity moments call in mind to honor complex forms of interdependence and to create modes of encounter for that difference. And that's really our leading quote during these webinars. Now, if we take a look at the history of the word neurodiversity, we can say that it as a term and movement emerged during the 90s and mainly in an online English autism community. And back then, neurodiversity referred specifically to autism as a neurological difference and variant within human diversity. You can parallel this with sexual and cultural diversity. So subsequently, autism was deployed as a social political identity. And this means initially that the focus was on identity politics. Now, according to this perspective, you could be proud, perhaps even for the first time, of your autism label, from which political rights could then be claimed to promote really participation in society. As a political platform, neurodiversity also offers the opportunity to resist drastic treatments prevalent at that time, such as the now infamous applied behavior analysis, ABA. But however, how powerful that word was, over the years, some critiques were formulated. For instance, the first critique is, it installed really a strong we-them discourse, and it was exclusively focused on autism. The second main critique is that people identifying as neurodivergent were initially also strongly opposed to the notion of autism as a disorder or as a disability, even in a militant way, and they were also against clinical support. So in that way, and so the critique goes, only so-called cognitively strong autistic adults would be considered to belong to the neurodivergent group, while people who are more experiencing more barriers, such as intellectual disability or people who don't use language to communicate, would be left in the cold. A third critique then is that it is too essentialist, also because of the word neuro. And also in clinical practice and research, some are using the word neurotypical and neurodiverse instead of control group and disabled group. And then, of course, the political power of neurodiversity is totally gone. Let us briefly consider these 4 critiques and start maybe with the word neuro, as sometimes we are also in doubt to this word. We did so much work to take some distance from the dominant forces of medicalization and psychiatrization, psychologicalization in the field of disability. And now we need this term in order to be taken seriously. So that feels strange sometimes. But when we are looking at the work neurodiversity is doing, it's clear that the word neuro is not so much an alignment to neurological per se, but rather, and this is a quote of Manning, but rather an engagement with the presuppositions of neurology as a science for and of the human. So the argument then to stick with the word neuro is not an essentialist argument based on biomedical reasons, but an argument based on collective affinity with a political and ethical base. And the word emerged from within the community, from bottom up, and played critically with the authority of the prefix neuro to do something else. It functioned as a line of flight, so to speak. It captured something that was appealing and recognizable for a lot of people, and therefore it became quickly embraced and distributed. After a while, the word did not refer to autism alone anymore, but was really questioning categories. And there you see an overlap with what is crip theory. It's a practice that turned out to work really strategically. The pragmatic force, in other words, seems useful. However, we remain skeptical about the use in the context of higher education. Is the concept of neurodiversity broad enough to capture the diversity in the needs and capacities? Does it help students to become recognizable as students in the context of higher education? And can we bring enough movement with the concept of neurodiversity? Over the years, from the 19th until now, neurodiversity has been used in activist groups within philosophical work, disability studies, and it is apparent that it is used differently and in a more inclusive way. It is not so much connected to autism anymore, nor to identity. It's rather used as a critical stance towards the frameworks on which our wide, heteronormative and ableist thinking and value systems are founded. And in that way, it really connects to crip theory again. So neurodiverse standpoints deconstructs the neurotypical as the norm. It points out that our frames of thought and value systems are not self-evident or natural, but have gained authority through particular contexts. And the neurotypical perspective here stands rather for the dominant and at the same time invisible perspective that determines how we look at concepts such as normality, knowledge, a good life, etc. So when the focus is not really on identity politics anymore, where do we go then? Well, then we shift towards the performative power without any ends. So in other words, the question also shifts from what neurodiversity is to what it does. How does it work? And what are the possibilities and opportunities that people, students can get by using different readings in the context of education and not being locked up into one story? And to make this all of how we use neurodiversity tangible, we bring in Helene, a young woman we work already for a long time with. Helene is now 20, and in her last year of secondary school, we worked with her over the last 3 years to find new and more creative ways of communicating and be part of her network in thinking also about future perspectives in higher education.
In reading Helene from different angles, we can use the standpoints interchangeable. We can move in and out according to what gives the most opportunities to Helene to participate and belong in the context. The first reading we want to explore is the Autism Canon. It goes together with the label of autism, and we see different things in the life of Helene. Helene has no verbal speech. She has difficulties to show what she's able to do. It is very difficult to know what is going on when she does not respond. Is it one of her health issues that is blocking her? Is she just not interested? Is she not able to bring in what she's thinking? Is it a question of concentration? At times, her fears, her compulsions, and her demands to be close can be very strong. For a long time, her parents were very resistant toward the label of autism. It seemed so suffocating, and both of them had fear that it would stop other people from working and trying with Helene. They were terribly worried that the label would diminish her chances. In this individual way of approaching, the problems are inherent to Helene, and the focus is very much on treatment, rehabilitation, and possible interventions, again on Helene. It leaves so much territories unexplored. The family wants something else. They want to focus on Helene's preferences and desires and start from there. On the other hand, they also use the label autism and this way of thinking. When we are searching at the moment to take steps in the restricting communication of Helene, we are experimenting with facilitated communication. We came up with other people who used it through the work of Manning and the autistic people they work closely together with. This Autism Canon is extremely dominant and well known among professionals. We think the diagnosis delivers plausible and causal answers. However, when Helene gets stuck, this standpoint does not give enough to go on to support Helene and her network. So it's important in taking up other standpoints that we don't focus only on Helene as an individual, but that we look at how she interacts with different contexts in specific moments in time and place. We bring context into play, and it gives us more tools and opportunities to work with, instead of only with and on Helene. A second reading we want to introduce are the social structures. Then we are not starting from Helene, who is holding the problem in her body, but we are starting from the structures in education, in healthcare, who are creating barriers for participation. We have to take into account how they are designed by ableist norms, with not a lot of room for difference and variation. In the social structures of education, we see a continuous repetition of exclusion. Each time schools, teachers, when they meet Helene, they are reluctant and they have very low expectations of what Helene is able to learn. If you do not communicate in a verbal way, people are often seen as not able to learn, and not able to attend classes and contribute in that class. During secondary education, we started each year at the end of the summer by introducing Helene to the teachers and by giving more information about what her parents expect from school. It needed to be legitimized over and over. Why is she here? How does she learn? Why is she not in a special school with other children in the same condition and who understand her? The further we come in education, the more narrow structures begin to define what learning is and can be. On the other hand, the structures are very important to start from and then launch us into experimentation. The timetable, the teachers, the subjects, the projects, instructions, the activities for all the other students are the place of departure, and then we adapt these to what is possible for and with Helene. It opens an ongoing negotiation. The Autism Canon, the social structures, let us look to a third reading we want to do or we want to bring into the situation of Helene. Then we are starting from relational connections and from the proximity Helene asks from her environment. Touch is a matter of response, a condensation of responsibility, how Barat puts it. What happens in that context cannot be reduced to an active-passive relationship, nor to an independence-dependence or volition-non-volition dichotomy. Rather, it creates a radical relationality which becomes, and now we quote Manning, a reciprocity in a field of experience that unlocks, directs movement in a way that enables communication in and beyond language. Helene is since a long time working with personal assistants to give her the support and safety that she needs, to make sure that she has the accommodations that are necessary, to bridge and bond with teachers and with the other students, to arrange her mobility and food, communication needs, and a slower pace. The guiding force of her parents and sister are very important as a motor behind the choice for inclusion and inclusive education. When we are gathering 4 times this year to think about her future after secondary education, we brought together a lot of important people who are willing to think further, deeper, and more creative. All school teachers, personal assistants, peers, therapists, friends from the family. And we are all brainstorming around the table while Helene is lying in her chair in the living room, hearing us, seeing us, from a distance responding by making noises and laughing. She does not want to sit with us, but she's there and is addressed in the conversations. Often in this relational way of reading Helene, we have special attention for the material entries in her context. The interests of Helene are often a starting point in the relationship. Cell phones, turning windmills, toys that make noise and give light, swings. Helene's voice can be expressed and heard, seen and felt in many forms. Her voice is a process of connecting bodies, objects, spaces, and many more. It opens up our fixed ideas of how learning and involvement could or should look like. What happens when using these different readings? We are constantly going in and out to different perspectives in searching what is necessary for Helene to flourish at a given time and in a given context. not constantly trapped in the autism canon, but able to use it when it helps to find attunement between what a student is able to do and what is expected from the context. We are pinching holes in grand structures and use different perspectives through one another to bring in continuous movement. We are looking at Helene as coming into existence in the moment, who is always in connection with her material and non-material context. This is not only about Helene as an exceptional or a very special person, but it resonates with all of us. Like our colleagues Goodley and Brunswick-Cole put it, differences can open up to look for potentialities, for conceptualizing disability or difference, not always as a lack, but as an opportunity to revise notions of normality, independence, and autonomy.
So I think this was something you were preparing for the first question we were tackling. I could hear a lot of very specific points of view, like it's not about personal characteristics, it's a phenomenon. It's something very complex. It's grown from bottom up. There is an overlap with crib theory. We are looking for movement, performative power. What are the opportunities? And you get away without getting away from the stupid disability studies model thinkers by combining the canon, the social structures, and the relational connections. And this is all brought together around somebody you know very well, both of you, Helene. Is it just for the audience, is it possible to explain what time is doing in your relationship with Helene? Because I can imagine that somebody who's working in higher education is now gone away, is flabbergasted by your introduction, saying, I don't have the time to do this. I don't know my students like this. I don't have all this. Tell us something about time and the process.
Can we link that also already to higher education, how we don't see?
Of course, because it's a bridge to the second question. If we take your point of view, what does that mean for higher education? How would we rethink the higher education? It's also a phenomenon, I think, as it is now.
When working with Helene, time is differently. We are asked to work more slowly, but if you connect that to higher education, where everything is put on the individual and fast learning and as much as you can on a short time, we of course need to think, what does this mean then for higher education, and how can we think about higher education and take into account the slower pace. And what works for us to go to higher education is working with certain concepts as accessibility, negotiation, relationality, and interdependence. And so we don't go really to time, but in those concepts, time is captured already.
Okay. I think it's so important to keep that connection as an extra focus. So let's go to Fritz to save his life before going to the second question.
I also think that the long period we already know Helene and her family is very important in knowing how these layers work, or how these different readings have become really part of our collaboration together. So it helped us to move slowly into knowing that at certain moments we are really trapped, and how can we then again install movements, or what is possible to look for when we are really locked in, or when we don't know anymore what to do. Then it helps us to create movement by using those different perspectives. And while knowing the family for a long time, it helps you to see how they address that and how they work with that in the different settings they use with Helene.
Thank you. So now we go to the second question, and you were bringing in already the 4 perspectives, or the 4 entrances you want to take, starting with accessibility.
Yeah, starting with accessibility, indeed. But accessibility doesn't come alone. It's also about negotiation, the relationality, and interdependence, always. And when we were thinking about these questions, we were circling around the idea of little acts of resistance against very rigid assumptions and presuppositions of what learning should be, what a student should be, what teaching should be, and which expectations need to be achieved by every student in the same way. And we see that students who would identify as neurodivergent need to deliver proof for their diagnosis. That's the situation here. They need to prove their diagnosis in order to be entitled to certain accommodations or facilitations. So on the basis of a medical psychiatric labels, students can enforce measures that meet that they are struggling with. And it's then very often just picking from standard protocols, more time, or being allowed to plan the exams themselves, being able to use speech software during an exam. And in contrast with the United Nations Convention, the measures are often not individually tailored to what students really experience as support, but they are based on standard approaches with one-size-fits-all approach, with a great deal of suspicion also on each level of the organization, here the university of the college. Maybe we want to say something also about those accommodation and facilitations.
Because I think today accommodation and facilitation starts very much from the idea that disability is in the individual. In her talk, in the previous seminar, Erin Manning also said something quite strong about reasonable accommodations. She said it leads to a status quo, maintaining the system like it is and like we know it. And her statement, it kept us busy. We also talked about it, Geert, and it made us think a lot. Within higher education, you can see that neoliberal ways of thinking have manifested the desire to bring students, and not only students, under control. The tendency to question any form of imposed order has been defined as a problem, rather than as a necessary virtue for students. So we see a lot in neoliberal ethics who reduces students with a label as being a problem, as a burden, whose irreducible alterity is set in place by categorization of them as the other. And with reasonable accommodations, we are not bringing any movement in that system. We are assuming that students need to adapt and meet the requirements and competences that are set out in order to succeed and be recognized as a good student within higher education. So it is not clear. For us also, we kept thinking about that, whether students themselves want to disclose their needs. Because sometimes we see that students have a lot of doubts about that because they do not want to be seen as weak or as inferior or only through the eyes of their label. And we see that also that we discuss that also, for example, in an internship meeting with psychologists and pedagogues, the discussion arose as to whether someone with ADHD can do an internship as a psychologist. One of our colleagues put it like this. He said, given the limitations associated with the disorder, I don't think it's possible to become a psychologist then. If you tell on your exam that you cannot concentrate for longer than 20 minutes and you are insisting on oral examination, how can you become a good psychologist then? You need to be able to do serious conversations that last longer than 20 minutes. And you need to be able to write reports. It is a basic competence of every psychologist, surely. And then you also see him moving. On one hand, they cannot do it. And on the other hand, it should be the disability officer of the university who conducts standard disqualification interviews with these students at the beginning of their study. Surely, we should not be involved in that or be busy with talking to students about those things. And then you can feel that when students experience these kinds of ideas, they are on their guard. They apply for facilities at the disability service that centralizes everything around label, around disability, and then dispatches it to different faculties and lecturers. It is not always possible for students to make direct contact with the lecturers about what is necessary. On the one hand, we can look at this and see that these channels create more naturalness and less obstacles and personal discussions. But on the other hand, they also create distance and more bureaucracy without any dialogue or negotiation between who is really concerned directly.
So you question reasonable accommodations and you question the position of the disability officer. That's nice. That's nice to discuss, yeah.
Because I think on one hand, we can see that it opened up the discussion. On the other hand, is this really changing or rethinking our structure? Or is it only capturing them inside our structures and giving them the space they are entitled to be in? So it is it creates a lot of tension.
And also it's like the picking. You can have ADHD, but you can't have any disorder that is not listed. Although dysorthography in English, it does not exist, the university would say. Mm-hmm. So then the student falls into the categorization of dyslexia, for instance. So you need to work then with the categories that are available at the university.
Mm-hmm.
So all those with ADHD have to visit the sports faculty. That's better than becoming psychologist. I'm joking.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But within that way of working, Elisabeth told about the ADHD person that is not recognized, yeah, and then we see that the diagnosis perspective of the medical perspective is used, and we don't see many possibilities anymore to come up with different readings like we did with Helene, that possibility is closed. Mm-hmm. But when we talk to students, they are often asking for understanding and respect from teachers and to be able just to mingle in the group with the others. It's crucial actually that every student feels welcome instead of putting everyone in categories and creating separate possibilities for each category. We are more, if you are asking what we try to do. We are more in favor of very flexible and adjustable ways of working, where all students should be approached in an inclusive way. Think of lecture recordings. I think we can all remember the first discussions around how lecture recordings would make students lazy. They would discourage them from going to class, give teachers anxiety about how or who could see these recordings and how the lecture recordings could be used in procedures and so on. But this is past since COVID. Recordings are standard and necessary to be able to continue teaching in these times. But the question is, what will we do with them when the situation again normalizes? And then it becomes very clear that people in crisis are willing, but with that, they do not fully touch or move the grammar or scholarship of higher education. And this ethics invites a collective knowing. The students, including those with a label, and the people who work with them are not separate to us, with one dominant and active and the other passive and subordinate.
And then we are not turning towards the neoliberal ethics, but we are turning to Bharat, who says, can you move to the next slide? Yeah. Ethics is about mattering, about taking into account of the entangled materializations of which we are parts, including new configurations, new subjectivities, new possibilities. Even the smallest cuts matter. Responsibility is then a matter of the ability to respond, listening for the response of the other, and an obligation to be responsive to the other, who is not entirely separate from what we call self. We are in the boat together. And how can we deal with this? We want to develop neurodiversity as a space, which is ontologic, epistemological, and ethical at the same time, an ongoing and symbiotic phenomenon, rather than being understood as a meeting place for ontologically separable subjects, to which ethics is later attached.
When we were thinking about it, sorry?
And that is bringing us to almost to the third question, because you are bridging now to what what are the possibilities of higher education to learn from neuroatypicality. And I really like the idea that you were thinking in the last part about the question, what happens when the situation normalizes? I can tell you a little anecdote. Ghent University is writing a paper at the moment, a big paper about education in the next 10 years, and they skip COVID. COVID is not there because they think there will be no more COVID. Situation will normalize, so everything will be the same. We will be singing the same song we were singing before COVID. Nothing happened. So the idea that you can learn something, the idea that you can have something that gives you power, that you're looking for opportunities, is still not there. So I asked the woman who has the lead to put a COVID banner on all the pages to make sure we don't forget that COVID is in every page somewhere. But it shows very, very clearly what you are talking about. And it's a phenomenon, but it's also a space. It's also thinking about situations. So it would be nice to, yeah.
Yeah, and also how hard it is to rethink structures. How hard it is. The only thing we could come up with was pinching little holes. Then we deleted little because we thought, okay, little is maybe then we are too skeptical, but in the moment, in the encounter, maybe it is possible to do something differently than what you are used of doing, but it is very hard work. So we are we use the words the whole time, rethinking, reimagining, reconfiguring, rewiring, but we need to be aware how difficult it is and what we are taking into our mouths at that moment and what we are able to do in that sense.
And Fritz completely agrees, I think. Fritz completely agrees with pinching. I could see it.
Yeah, but I was teaching about the idea of pinching holes in structure at a college in Antwerp, and students answered that that is more hopeful thinking. It helps me that I don't have to change everything tomorrow, but I can start with pinching holes. So I liked that answer of that student. So
and it's a shared responsibility for all of us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were brainstorming about this pinching holes in structures and power hierarchies, we want to think what is then important, what are the concepts that help us in doing that, and to keep the movement going, because if you pinch a hole there, it will close on another part. So the exclusions will shift. So it's important that we keep moving and we keep pushing. So we came up with 3 entrances or modes for this webinar. And to start with, we have relational accessibility. That's our first entrance, with the head question is how to keep moving and how to be in the movement. A relational accessibility, I really like that concept, and it's a concept of Tanya Tichkowski, who will also present the webinar later on in this series. So I think it's nice to make already a connection to her work. What we want to see accessibility really as an ongoing process and not as a checkbox. That's accessibility or universal design, so to speak. We really want accessibility as a continuous way of work, an ongoing process in which structure, then here of higher education, are made smooth, or a certain flexibility is required. It's really a variant of pinching holes for us. How accessible and welcoming can we be? And there is a lot going on here for the students who have often repeatedly experienced exclusion on their educational pathway, pioneering students, but also students from migrant backgrounds, disabled students, students with mental health problems. And we want to work with the process of accessibility in all its complexity. And this means also that the question changes from what is wrong with this student into what is needed for this student lecturer in this group. And this emphasis on relation also means negotiation, and more precisely local negotiation. It's going back and forth between students and context. What are the needs in this student at this moment, in this specific context, with this curriculum, these goals, working in this group with this teacher.
Movement is a very important aspect of relational accessibility, and our habitual categorizations limit our capacity to see the unexpected and our capacity to be open to what we don't yet know. So we are constantly looking to question the limiting habits of categorization, and in opening up new ways of questioning and of engaging with students. At the same time, we need to be aware that exclusion is not something that we can exterminate or escape from. The demarcations between neurotypicality and neurodiversity, between independence and dependence, in and out, are constantly repeated and strengthened in the context of higher education. So we need to keep looking for movement in the student processes, to use the entanglements with the context to overcome barriers in a cautious, tentative and experimental way, through small cracks.
And if you would ask, where can you learn this to do? If we think about where do we want to learn about relational accessibility? Then we need to look at from stories where relationality is dismissed. And for instance, there is a student who was asked to hand in a preparation to teach in primary school, and to hand in his preparation 3 days before he would teach at a certain class. And he did not meet that deadline. He only handed in his preparation 2 days before. And because this happened 2 times already in his school career, he is dismissed from education. They said, okay, that's the rule. You have to hand in 3 days before. And all the circumstances that there is COVID, there is a child at home, blah, 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 it doesn't matter. You have to stop. And then we see, okay, this is bureaucracy who's taking over. The school is really saying our responsibility stops here. It would be very other question if in this story, internship coach would ask, what can I do, or how can I help? How can we as the school help to make you the best teacher you can be in this moment? And that's a question, a relational question, and it's a messy thing. It's more difficult to do that than to say, okay, here is my responsibility, the responsibility of the school, and you just have to quit. And
shared
these are the stories where we... Sorry?
It's about shared responsibility instead of deadline thinking.
Yeah.
A second entrance we want to point out, or we want to talk about, is relational accessibility and then interdependency, because I think we fall back a lot on how are we dependent on each other in order to move forward in this searching. And what we see is that in higher education, a key strategy of neoliberalism is individualization. It puts individuals against each other in precarious, competitive, social and institutional environments. And higher education is very typical for this setting. The student who is categorized as different from the norm is then perceived as having a problem, rather than questioning the normalizing discourses and practices themselves. And this process of categorization can be described as ejecting the other, placing the difference in the other. A Schildrick analysis shows the abjection serves both to construct and to protect normalized identities as being not dead, not at risk of being cast out. The discourses at work are multiple and entangled, and individuals are made responsible for the success of higher education and for the problems they are confronted with.
I would like to focus on collaboration and interdependence that might take place among various players, not through allocation of individual responsibility and blame, not through the intensification of vulnerability and insecurity, but through developing communities capable of rethinking our daily practices in higher education. It demands of us that we find new ways of connecting with the world, human and non-human, more than human, which involves giving up our own fixities. And then we could ask other questions. And also the question is how sometimes to invest in higher education in questions like, how do we support a relation of lecturers with students? How do we stimulate young people to work together, to have an open mind when working within a system that demands individual excellence? How do we affirm students in their multiple becomings? How do we make use of standards of measurement and evaluation in our course and negotiate that with students? Can students make a master thesis with 2? That's not allowed at our department. At the medical department, it is allowed to make in a duo a master thesis because there are not enough supervisors to supervise each student.
These questions are for us also open ends. We don't know a lot, but we want to share the questions and think together with other people around what could this mean? What spaces can it open up to rethink and to start in our practices to do things differently at certain moments with certain people, the best we can do it at that moment.
To make sure we keep some time left to think with the audience, people who attend the meeting. We have some 10 minutes left now for entrance 3, I think, because I thought there were 3 entrances. And then we jump for the last question we work with this afternoon. Is that okay?
Okay, that's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the third entrance is an entrance we always end up with. So again, today we end up with desire. And the quote of Masumi, dare to become what all you cannot be. Any student, any person who is working in higher education is in constant becoming, a continuing journey which has no beginning and no ends, always in the middle. And Deleuze and Guattari do not think in terms of stable and fixed identities, but nomads, assemblages that crosses borders and categorizations. And desire is a driving force behind becoming. Desire always allows ongoing movement, flows, transformations. And desire pushes and leads to new and positive futures, always discovering new connections and possibilities. It helps us for thinking about difference in an affirmative and productive way, because it reads body-minds in relation to their contextual positioning and the actions they undertake. And here there is an invitation to analyze with students constraining and enabling factors and to avoid passing judgments on the students and on what they are and are not able to do. And ethics without morality asks of every human being involved, what can I do? What am I capable of doing? Given my degree of power, what are my capabilities and capacities? And how can I go to the limits of what I can do?
And we also wanted to make the link again to crip theory, because crip theory is situated at the intersection of critical disability studies and queer theory, and it deposits also very strongly the idea that disability is to be desired. An important figure for me is Alison Kafer, and she states that she's not interested at all in becoming more disabled than she already is, but that desiring here is more targeting at not eliminating disability as something undesirable. It is that desiring disability is reacting against. It suggests that disability is part of the human condition and that it is something that could be desired for what it can give and what it gives to the world. This has to do with disability as something productive in the world. Affirmation of difference is then very, very central in the process. And I think that is the end of our 3 entrances that are really important in working with punching holes with that idea.
And I love the idea that entrance 3 got entrance 2 as title on one of the slides. That shows how active these entrances are. They can become 2, 1, or 3, whatever entrance you take. That gives us some minutes left to discuss the last question about the intersection of what you were discussing before with the idea that the debate about decolonial and post-colonialism in universities and higher education has taken. Do you see a kind of intersection, or how do you think about what we were discussing before and other parallel discussions that are running through institutions, cultures, human brains, whatever, stomachs?
Yeah, and we really started thinking about this that parallel because of the work of Erin Manning, of course, but also because of seeing the movie Crip Camp, documentary Crip Camp. There you see how Black community and disability comes together, how they are learning from each other in activism and in pragmatism, and also in creating archives. Like in here in the Netherlands and in Belgium, there is no archive or history of disability activism. And yeah, it's not that strong. It's not taught at high school, you see. And I think the work done, the logics or the processes busy in decolonizing are intersecting with the process and logics with in disability communities. Also, it's the importance of little stories, and not only of deconstructing histories, but also in creating and thinking about the future. And yeah, the local and little stories are important there. And one thing I found interesting more recently, also starting from Manning and reading Manning, is the concept of oh, it's on my slides, fugitivity from Fred Moten. But there I was reading Fred Moten and I really saw a sentence, a phrase that could be in Alison Kafer's book. And there was, he of course, fugitive, but Fred Moten is a very strong concept, but he was writing about it as it's the refusal of what has been refused to them, to the slave. He's referring to slavery, to them, and the consent to what has been imposed on them, to refuse what is normatively desired and to claim what is normatively disavowed is our lot. And there I really saw the connection with crip theory, but I need to read a lot more. But for me at this moment, and I also have that from Bambra, Gabriel and Mika Ciolci, is we need to deconstruct to create the most authoritarian narratives, but it's really also about reconstructing little stories and creating new communities and stories.
Okay, thank you. No, Elisabeth, you wanted to say something? Sorry.
I just wanted to add that our beginning question is very important for us. What makes a human being recognizable? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that is a shared question in both ways of thinking, with being very careful also to talk about and just give very simple answers to these questions, because your questions were very difficult at certain moments. And we need to think very hard about them.
And you gave us multiple readings, multiple entrances, multiple possibilities, pinching to move. So I think I really enjoyed the way you were trying to bring all these ideas together, knowing, Leni, how much you want to read and how much you want to bring in authors from your part. And I know, Elisabeth, from your part, beside of the reading, there is also an enormous engagement with families like the family of Helene, who is now also very well known to Leni. And the only moment I said, like, don't say that. I think in the Netherlands they have some historical background about movement. Go to Jan Troost, his website. He was once living in the woods, and in his website Going Back to the Woods, he collects stories of people with disabilities who are talking about their emancipation and their structural discrimination they were connected to along the life. So
yes,
if
it's
you
not
talk
part
about
of our
Belgium,
history books.
yeah, I know, but it's there. We only need teachers who have to learn to think into this kind of work. So thank you for this presentation, for your answers. Thank you, Fritz, for being so kind to your mother. I think this is also very important. I think this is the moment for our colleagues who attend the meeting to ask questions. And Nikki is trying to observe the chat, I think. So
Yeah.
if you want.
So yeah, as a reminder, we'll switch to our Q&A time. Thank you so much to you both for the presentation, both what you shared verbally, but also what was presented on the slides. So much for us to think about. I'm sure we're going to have a good bit of questions and conversation here. So I think Nikki is going to allow or invite all of our attendees, if they would like to turn their video on, we can transition to that now. Of course, it's just your choice. You don't have to accept that invitation. You can stay with your video and audio off. But Nikki, let me know in a minute if you need help sending those invites.
I'm okay for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll just remind everybody that there is a Q&A box or button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This is the place for you to type in questions if you would like to just write a question, and myself or Nikki can voice that for you to our panelists today. If you would like to accept the invite to turn your video on, please keep your audio muted until and use the kind of raise your hand function. That way Nikki and I can call on people as they have questions and are ready to ask those to our panelists. So I see a few people are coming in now. If there's somebody who has a question and they want to use the raise hand function, please go ahead and do that. Or if somebody has a question they want to type in, please go ahead now and do that, and we'll get started in some dialogue here. Or if Nikki or Viv have a question they want to start us off with, feel free to get us going, as others are still, I think, trying to transition into the video here.
Well, maybe I could just say a few words. Wow, the work that you did and the path that you traveled to answer these questions. I can't believe, you know, the journey you've taken us through, sort of the whole of disability studies, post-humanism, new materialism. It was so inclusive and so thoughtful. So I really want to say thank you very much for you know, paying such huge attention to these questions. Maybe just to follow up, because it's one thing that I didn't really sort of understand, or maybe what you were trying to say, but in terms of what higher education can learn, you know, from difference, you know, I think it is sort of, you've put it into all your thoughts, but maybe if you could just sort of directly answer that question. I mean, what are things like neuroatypicality? I mean, even if we can sort of put people on a continuum like that, but what is it that is special, that higher education, or don't you believe that it's special? Because I just came across in Facebook today a book written by two people who are who identify, I suppose you would say, as being on the autistic spectrum, saying that they have special abilities, you know, to do qualitative research because of, you know, what they see as their abilities. So yeah, I'm just interested to see how you would respond to that.
I think it hangs together with relationality. for us, it always starts out of a negotiation and a smoothing of hierarchical positions towards each other. Because a lot what we encounter in higher education has to do with assessing a certain hierarchy. And all the time you are looking, how can you smooth those spaces? We are always talking about the unknown, but do we really dare to go in the unknown? And a lot of the time when we encounter families who have children who are labeled as disabled, we see it's like not an option. It's a necessity to go where you don't know where to go. So learning from those ways of relating to each other and those ways of living together on a daily basis, it helps us to be courageous at certain moments. Yeah. So I think the relationality is extremely important and not addressed enough in the structures and in how we are able to do teaching and research and other things that we do in higher education.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in the so-called assessment. You know, how could we do those sorts of things differently? Because I think that this is, you were just describing, you know, people being late, and I know that Erin also spoke about, you know, doing assessment a little bit differently. Do you have some ideas?
Maybe the course of coaching and diversity. Yeah.
In the course where we work with students, when Leni is talking about coaching and diversity, one of our colleagues here, Lieve, knows it very well also, because we are in it together. We are working with students who are doing mentoring for students in lower years. And in assessing, in looking for communities where we can address the needs of students, it's really much more about negotiation. So the assessment is, I don't think we can change it completely, but we can have spaces where we do it differently. When you see it, how students do it towards each other and with each other, you see different words coming up. But it's really also practicing to find the words we need in order to see what can assessment be on the question, what do you need in this moment, in this context, with this situation, and to address the thisness in that. But it will not be an answer, but it's searching for how can we do this differently, because it's necessary.
As a little sidestep, Viv, what Elisabeth and Leni are talking about is a process for more than 5 or 6 years now. So it was not invented at a spot. It has to be taken up. I think that's what Elisabeth is calling. You have to learn to be courageous. You have to go back and back to the same topic. You have to go back and back to the same questions, without having a quiz where you know all the answers, but by reinventing the same story again and again. But after a certain time, it becomes part of culture, it becomes part of thinking, it becomes part of relationships, it becomes part of hierarchy also, I think, because there is still an evaluation moment at the end. There is, so the structure is there, but the structure is a bit wobbly.
Yeah. So if I could come in here, because where my mind is going, which it shouldn't be, is looking at time. And so, and I'm quite captivated by the idea of the little holes, you know, puncturing little holes into the structure. So over this 5-year period, what has shifted? I know it's anecdotal, but is there a way of putting words to the quality or the culture or the whatever? What has changed?
What I think what has changed in the beginning, the idea of mentoring was very central in the course. It was about mentoring, and a lot of questions came to us on what is the impact and what will be the difference on how the students perform throughout the university. Now I think we have bended the questions also. It's like an encounter with difference. And what does it do? What does it do with both students? What can we learn from that? And how can we use it, the encounters between the students, to think about diversity in our faculties? What does it mean? What do students think we can do with this? And it invites them in an ongoing discussion. So we are less focused on the products, but more on the process. I think that is something that has really changed over the 5 years, but also in trying to experiment with the students on what they can and they cannot do. In the beginning, it was much more that we needed to give clear structures for the students to invite them to come to us. Now it's much opener, and you can see that it gives a lot of insecurity, but we just give them the floor and see what comes out of them with some points of that we address them directly, but at other points we just give them much more space than we did in the beginning. But it's really searching. It's also a team that is behind this. And I think the falling back on that team is also very important for us to see how far can we go. Is this okay? How do the faculties respond to this? Also, when you see the students who come together and who come from different faculties, an engineer with a lawyer, with a psychologist, talking together about what does it mean to support another student. They sometimes the students said, reflection, what is that? What is going on here? The exchange that starts up then, it's so interesting to learn from that.
And maybe to say something about time and the importance of process then in research. Sorry, Fritz is crying and shouting extremely hard. I don't know if you hear it.
It's fine.
Do you hear it?
Oh,
Yeah, we
God.
can, but it's
Okay.
He has a good voice.
Yeah. But about time and process in research, we were talking in working with Helene a lot about focus. Leni, focus on the process. You don't have to develop a methodology or a key towards a solution for her. It's about the process, and a lot of things are coming from the process. But how are you dealing with that if you also need to write articles about that process? And I took time, and it took time to find words and to be articulate about that process. And still, when I start a new project, I'm still doubting, and okay, it's the process. And then the idea of Stephanie Springay, who was with us in the other webinar series about the speculative middle helps. Be and dare to be in that speculative middle. But then I as a researcher was in need of time sometimes, and I needed to slow down to find words to articulate that process. And what is important at this moment for me is to write together, and not just someone who is reading what I've read and say, okay, it's okay, and do several adjustments, but really to write together, because I don't think alone. I always think in collaboration, and I also want to make that visible in academia. And these are my little cracks then. How do I use references? Who is the co-author, and I know the system asks to write alone more and more, but I don't want to because that's not fair. And there, Manning is also helping in giving me words to see what is interdependency and are we allowed to be interdependent also in assessment or in articles.
Okay. Leni, it gives you blood pressure problems. The song of your son is giving you blood pressure problems. Don't worry, don't worry. It's
Yeah,
good
he's
for
sick,
his it's good for his development. Go for it. Are there any other questions in the chat, Nikki?
I don't see any questions in the Q&A, but I agree with Viv. What we've seen today, what we witnessed today is it's so broad, and it's always so useful hearing Manning, Barad, who we've all been reading, a lot of us have been reading together, framed by others, and it kind of adds another dimension, another level to my learning. So I really, I want to also just say thanks to Elisabeth and Leni for today's presentation. And Fritz.
This session will be known as the session with Fritz. It will be very important for the future.
Reading
yes,
Fritz.
I noticed that we're getting close to our time. I don't see any questions in the Q&A box or any hands raised. So Geert and Viv, would you like to wrap us up and share about our next webinar that's coming up as well?
Yeah, thank you, Candace. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. We did say, Candace did tell you that the webinar is recorded and that we'll post the information on the webinar series webpage. And you can also access the recording on YouTube. And you can also actually subscribe to the YouTube channel and get updates when a new recording is posted. And I think Nikki also posted on Facebook. So just a reminder that our next webinar is on January the 20th, with next year, 2022, with Jeffrey Riolme. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his surname, but maybe Geert knows better than me. He's from York University in Toronto. And that's the time is 8:30 a.m. Central Standard Time in the US, 3:30 p.m. Central European Standard Time, and 4:30 p.m. in Cape Town. So please do check the webinar website to confirm the times and access the Zoom link. And they're usually suggested readings on the website. And you can also contact Nikki for access to them if you need it. So you just can Google the University of Missouri webinar series to find out more. And Nikki could let you know anything that isn't there that you want to find out further.
Yeah, Viv, I've just put my email address and the link to the website in the chat. So if anyone would like to be added to the mailing list when the reminders do go out, if you aren't already on the mailing list, please just drop me an email and I'll add you to the list. Thanks.
So thank you, everybody. And thank you for all the participants. I see some quotes coming in to the chat at the moment. And I think everybody has enjoyed this afternoon session for the European timetable or morning or evening session for other timetables. I'm really looking forward for the next meeting because Geoffrey will take us as somebody who is an expert in history to the history of the movement also in Canada, where he's an expert in. And I think it's so important to think about certain phenomena as Leni and Elisabeth were describing, with history in mind. And I think it's so important we know what happens if we become ahistorical and decontextualized, then we end up as multiple choice freaks. So thank you for everything. And I hope if you have some holidays in the next weeks, or if you have some days around a Christmas tree or whatever symbol you are using in your culture to enjoy the end of the year, I hope it will help us to take some extra energy to restart for 2022, but also to think over what COVID has done to our relationships in families, in teams, with friends. So I hope you will enjoy this time of the year. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you. Bye.